Hello railway and simulator enthusiasts, and welcome back to this series of tutorials on how to drive a train in France. Today we're in part number 2 of this series on the boards. So without further ado, let's get to it. The boards in France can be trackside, elevated, or near a signal, or even attached to the signal head. All boards are permanent or temporary. Some temporary ones can be used during a track work. So for the purpose of this guide, we will mostly focus on the boards used on the main lines. So this is going to be a non-exhaustive list of boards that can or will be used in, for instance, the Marseille to Avignon route. Not all boards will be included. For those of you who want to know about the boards used for the TVM, please refer to what will be part 4 of this series of guides. So let's first talk about the speed boards, which are the ones you will encounter most of the time. The first thing you need to know about the line speed limit system used in France is that each line has its own set of maximum allowed speed. Those are referred in the route knowledge or in sometimes a manual. The speed boards only temporarily modify the maximum allowed speed on the route. So let's see some of them. The first one is this one. It says km with a number under it. This is called in French a pancarte kilometrique, or in other words, the famous kilometer board. The kilometer board relays information related to a speed limit transition on the line. For instance, if the line speed is 110 and then jumps to 120 km per hour after the kilometer post 23.2, this is the board which will tell you that the line speed will jump to 120, providing that the rear of the train has cleared the board. Only then you will be allowed to run at 120 km per hour. All the speed boards are referred to as a TIV. I refer to those as such. TIV in French is Tableau Indicateur Vitesse, or Speed Indication Board in English. Before proceeding further, I first need to explain the color coding used by the TIVs. If you find a TIV with a white filling and a black border plus writing, in French this is a TIV à distance, TIV distance, and it is the warning for an upcoming speed restriction. If you find the opposite, as in a black filling with a white border and writing, this is called exécution, the same in English, the point at which the speed limit applies or starts to be enforced. So for the first example, we have a square, black border and black writing with a white filling, 60 km per hour written on it. As said before, this is TIV distance TIV. Those are only used when the speed limit difference is lower than 40 km per hour from the previous speed. You need to slow down to the indicated speed when seeing this board. So what do I mean when I say that the speed limit difference can only be lower than 40 km per hour from the previous speed? So let's take an example. The line speed or the current line speed limit is 80 km per hour. This board is only able to show at its lowest 15 km per hour. It cannot show a lower speed than this one, or expect in some rare cases 45 km per hour. But it is a rarer occurrence. As mentioned before, speedboards only temporarily modify the line speed in France. The board you're supposed to see after this one is this, called pancarte Z, or Z board. A white Z in a black square, with a white border as well. This is the beginning of the previously announced speed restriction zone, Z for zone, same in French. So in other words, if your previously announced speed on the distant TIV was 50 km per hour, this is the point at which your train should be running at 50 km per hour upon passing this board. When you have finished running under the 50 km per hour speed zone, you will see this board, the same as the Z, but with an R. Similar name is pancarte R board. And this is the end of the speed restriction. In French, the R would stand for reprise, but for English speakers, you can consider that this board means resume line speed when the rear of your train has cleared this board. It is important to mention the rear, not the front, as the entirety of your train must have cleared the speed zone before resuming to a higher speed. So in order, you should see those boards from left to right. Let's say the line speed is 90 km per hour in the present case. Distant TIV will tell you to slow down to 60 km per hour, so when you pass it, or when you see it at least, you should start slowing down to 60 km per hour. Then you encounter the Z board, that is the point at which you must be at 60 km per hour, not higher. Once you have cleared that zone, you will see the R board, at which the speed limit drops back up to 90 km per hour as the rear of your train passes this board. Even though we saw that in the previous cases we only saw one board at a time, it might happen that you see those two boards at once, a distant TIV above a Z board. What do you think it would mean? 60 and a Z. This is the point at which the announced speed immediately applies in reality. So you need to slow down to 60 km per hour before this board. You might see it when the previous line speed that you're running at allows you to slow down when you see this board to the required speed, or you might have to know this from that knowledge. In any case, when you pass this board, the line speed immediately jumps down to the announced speed on the distant TIV. So we only saw cases in which the speed difference from the line speed or the previous speed limit was less than 40 km per hour of difference. What happens when this is higher or equal? The board you're supposed to see, for instance, if the TIV shows 60 and the line speed is 100 km per hour, should be this way. This is still a distant TIV, and this still calls you to slow down to the line speed. But it is a bit different. This board is in reality protected by a crocodile. Crocodile, which we will refer to as... In part 1 of this series, I quickly mentioned that the crocodile is a trackside equipment used for the safety system that is repeating restrictive aspects in cab. I'll further explain the functioning of that in part 3 of this guide series. This board can also be supplemented by two flashing white lights on the top and the bottom of it. This is to indicate the speed related to a switch. So now, this board. It's a pretty specific shape, and this is a type B TIV. Same as before, this board calls the driver to slow down to indicate its speed, but it only concerns trains that are allowed to run faster than 140 km per hour. This board has no meaning for other type of trains. If you're confused yet, wait for the next one. The same board but inverted. It's a type C, and the type C is for EMUs, DMUs and rail buses. So having seen those type of TIVs, now we'll see this one. If you remember the rule, black square with a white border and writing, and remember the Z and R boards, you'd remember that this board is the point at which a speed limit applies. And this is what it is. It's also called rappel or reminder. If you remember part 1 of this series, you would remember that there's a signal aspect with the same name, and ergo the same meaning. So, this is the beginning of the previously announced speed restriction, in this specific case, 80 km per hour. So when passing this board, you should be running at the maximum speed of 80 km per hour. Same as previously said before also, speed boards only enforce temporary speed restrictions, and this specific limits, for instance, ends after the set of points that this board protects. The next one is slightly special. It is a distant TIV, as you can identify by the colors, but it has a single P on it. In French, this stands for préannonce, and we'll call it P board, tableau P in French. It is only for trains that can go beyond 160 km per hour, and it calls them to slow down to 160 and expect a further speed restriction. Only used on lines with a speed limit higher than 160 km per hour. So this is used in order to anticipate a further speed reduction that will go even lower than the current line speed. The next set of boards is a bit special, so we'll very quickly go through them. They are this type of board, which looks like an arrow with a single number on them. In French, those are called panneaux pentagonal, pentagonal board. A pentagon because it's a shape with 5 edges. It's a bit special as it's used only for freight and postal trains and sometimes some specific locomotives. Trains that need to follow this type of speedboards is referred into their technical manual. This doesn't apply to any of the routes that are currently coming to Train Sim World or the known routes in Train Simulator. If you know German or Dutch routes, you would know that the speedboards only display one number and multiply that number by 10 to obtain the speed limits. This is the same principle on this one. You need to multiply the indicated number by 10 to obtain the speed that is indicated by this board. So let's use it to review our TIV aspects. This is a distant TIV, TIV distance. And as you multiply the 4 by 10, this means 40, so slow down to 40 km per hour. If you invert the color scheme on this, you obtain the execution TIV. So this is the beginning of the previously announced speed restriction zone and it still has the number. So at this point, you should be running at 40 km per hour if your train must follow the indication of those. And if you invert the whiteboard and it doesn't have any number on it, this is the end of the speed restriction. So you can resume at line speed from this board when your rear of your train has cleared this board. There's a further set of speed boards that we need to see very quickly, and those are the work zone boards. And those are the work zone boards. The same rules apply, they just have a different shape. They're in a circle. There's also some additional ones that we need to see. For instance, a simple white circle with a black border means that it is the end of the work zone. This board, still white with a black border but with an arrow in it, indicates that the current direction is not affected by the work zone, e.g. you can simply follow the line speed on your track. The next board indicates the limited visibility of the next warning board in the next 100 meters. The next one is a yellow board with a black border and a blinking light in the middle. This is the beginning of a work zone with a speed limit which is under 40 km per hour. The blinking light in the middle is used for night operation for better visibility. This next board has white and black lines with a flashing light in the middle, and this is a warning of an upcoming indication for a work zone, so a speed warning in other words, in the next 200 meters. I'll admit all of those work zone related boards can be a bit confusing, but they need to be memorized for normal operation. So the next type of boards that we will see, I will call them the electrification boards. They are related to the operation of electric trains. You'll see them on the line from Marseille to Avignon, and they simply relay instructions related to electric trains and their power supply. They can relay information about the currents, the MCB status or the pantograph status. Reminder for the electrification in France, 1.5 kV and 25 kV. It's important to note that the 25 kV current has a distinction between the one used on the main classic lines and the one used on the high-speed lines, used by the TGV in other words. So let's start by this one, SEC T A 1000 meters. So in other words, this means section à 1000 or 1000 meters. Section in French refers to a neutral section. What this board tells you to do is to be ready to open the MCB. The next board is this one. The black drawing in the middle may remind you of some countries. This emoji-like board is often referred to in other countries in Europe as to the operation of the MCB. And this is the beginning of the neutral section at this board, and it's the order couper courant, cut power. At this board, the neutral section begins, so there is no power. So you need to make sure that your MCB is open before that board. The next board you can see is this one. And it is the end of the neutral section. So if you're running a locomotive, you may close and rearm the MCB at this point. It's important that I mention a locomotive, because reversible trains, those that have a pantograph at the back, may not be ready to open the MCB as their pantograph may still be on the neutral section. There is a help for that, and it is the REV board that I will call. REV means réversible in French. This is the verb that means can be reversed. So this concerns EMUs, in that case not DMUs, because they are not concerned by electric operations, and also push-pull sets with the locomotive at the rear, and they may close the MCB at this point, as it means that the rear of the train has cleared the neutral section. Next board is this one, a pretty specific shape, but you need to learn it and learn that it means that it is the warning for an upcoming baisser panto, or the lower pantograph. So you need to be ready to lower your pantograph at this point. Next is this one, still a specific shape, but it means the execution of baisser panto. Make sure your pantograph is lowered before this board. It might be that the overhead wiring ends after this point. When you rotate this aspect by 90 degrees, this is called relevé panto, re-raise pantograph. You can re-raise the pantograph again. Same as before, this can be used by locomotives as a marker to re-raise the pantograph from this point. EMUs and push-pull sets with a locomotive at the back can still encounter the REV board as an indication that they can re-raise the pantograph. The next boards are pretty special. This one is two purple squares with a white line in the middle. This is the end of the electrification. After this board, the electrification ends and you cannot draw power from it. So this indirectly calls for trains to stop at this board if they are electric. I've mostly seen this board used on sidings just before the buffer stop. The next board has a pretty similar function, except that it is an absolute one, and this is similar to the carré or square, but it is only for electric trains, and it tells them to stop at this board. They must not pass this board under any circumstance. So now let's see a new type of boards that I would say are shunting related boards. They relate information if you are shunting. The first one is kind of a similar board as the previous one with SAW, like the Z board, Z board, or R boards, but with a D. The D stands for dépôt, or depot in English, pretty transparent. So it means that this track is going into the depot area. The next board is a G board, G for garage, garage. In English, this would refer as a train maintenance building, but I'll just refer to it as a garage, and it simply means, same as before, that this track goes into a garage area indicated by this board. In this specific case, you are always proceeding into the garage as a shunting movement. The next one has IMP, imp, for impasse. In English, it means dead end. So this track has an end, mostly with a buffer stop on it. If you remember part 1 of this guide, you will remember that a single yellow aspect for an avertissement or warning can also route trains to a buffer. So in other words, this is a similar indication. Warning, this track ends soon. It can be supplemented by this board, which says heurtoir 150 meters. So heurtoir in English is a buffer stop. So there is a buffer stop in 150 meters. Be prepared for that. The next indication is SAS. There is no proper translation for it in English, but the way you need to understand it is that it is a short track generally used for reversing. For instance, if you arrive at the end of a line and need to reverse into the other platform, you will be routed to a track that has this board at the entrance. The next one reads LM. LM stands for Limite de Manœuvre. If you remember part 1 of this guide, manœuvre means shunting, so this is the shunting limit. So in other words, if you are shunting movement, and it is important to indicate that you are shunting movement, so mainline movements are not concerned by this board. If you're shunting movements, stop at this board. You are not allowed to proceed further unless approved otherwise by the signaler. The next board has LGR, limite de garage par refoulement, garage limit when reversing. So if you're in the cab that is facing the opposite direction from the movement of your train and you see this board, you need to stop at this point because it means that your train is in the garage. The next type of board is the station boards. Most of the station boards I'm going to talk about are related to the train stopping position. They use yet the same design as the execution boards, but as they're in stations, they have a different meaning. This one, for instance, has a 4V marking on it. V in French stands for voiture, which means a train car, train carriage, or wagon. When you see this board and you are stopping at this station, you need to stop at this board if your train has 4 cars. If this has 4V and 6V, then it means that you need to stop your train at this board, providing you're stopping at the station, if your train has 4 or 6 cars. That doesn't include trains that have 5 cars, either because they're not used or because they have a different stopping position. If this has 4A, 6V, so 4A 6V, 4 to 6V, you need to stop at this board if your train has 4 to 6 cars, so this time it includes trains that have 5 cars. One type of board that you'll see on the Marseille to Avignon DLC is this one, TGV1. So you need to stop at this board if your train is made of one TGV set. If your TGV set is made of 2 of them, then you need to stop at the TGV2 board. Stations that don't have a specific stopping position for different train types will have this one with TT, which stands for tête de train, head of trains. Any train must stop at this board, providing that they are stopping at the station, obviously. The last one of this series is the station announcer. I'll use this fictive one, which says Marseille à 1,200 meters. So it means that the next station which is coming, Marseille station, is at 1,200 meters, 1 kilometer point 2. Finally, we'll go through one last type of boards that are called the spatial boards. The first of them is a white S in a rectangular black board. S in French stands for sifflet, which literally translates to whistle. So when you see this board, you need to use the whistle or horn. This board that uses the distant TIV design with an L on it is for lavage, which means washing. So which means that you are routed towards a train wash. A long rectangular board with a destination name written from top to bottom is a direction board, and this one would mean that you're going in the direction of Marseille, the indicated direction on this board. This board is used to indicate tunnels or low clearance obstacles. The next board indicates the beginning of a switch. It is an arrow pointing down. The same board exists pointing up, and it is a bit of a complicated meaning. The brief explanation that I can give is that several tracks are commanded by a single signal. The rule for passing this board would be to stop, then check for other traffic before proceeding. This is a pretty complicated board that can be used in pretty different situations, so I will not comment much on it. But this is the rule that you will need to keep in mind if you encounter this one. If you're familiar with the German railways, you may have encountered this type of boards. In French, those are called mirlitons. They signal that you are approaching a signal with a reduced visibility, so you need to be ready to see that signal and potentially acknowledge it and respond to its order. The only order you could encounter those are 3 stripes, then 2, then 1 before the signal. Each stripe indicates 100 meters. So the first one means that the signal is at 100 meters. The next one indicates that the signal is at 200 meters, and the one with 3 stripes, 300. There is something to know about whether or not you will encounter this full sequence. You will encounter one board, one mirliton, if the line has a speed limit between 0 and 60 km per hour, 2 if the line has a speed limit between 60 and 120 km per hour, and 3 if that line speed is higher than 120 km per hour. Last before we finish is boards that have an arrow under it. That can also be for signals, and it indicates which track received the information or order. If you do not have any arrow, you should assume that the board is only for trains that are running to the right of that board. As trains run on the left-hand side in most of France, you would have to look at the board or signal that is to your left, unless there is only one of them for your line. Those can be on the right if there is limited clearance to install that board of signal on the left, or if you're running in the Alsace region. Then you would need to assume that the boards or signals to the right are for your track. Let's imagine that this board isn't installed on the platform, but is installed instead in the middle of two tracks, but it only considers the track to the left of it, so the board will be on the right hand side of the train driver. The driver will know that this board considers them thanks to that arrow that indicates to which track this order is to. You can also encounter this same aspect, but with two arrows indicating that this isn't exclusive to the left-hand track, but instead concerns both tracks. So one last thing. If this board is placed at the beginning of a switch, then the arrows can also designate which switch direction is affected by the indication. So this specific one would mean that if you are going to the leftmost direction and the direction just right of it, then you would need to pass this switch at 80 km per hour, but not if you're going in another direction. Thank you very much for following this video. I hope this is helpful to you. In part 3, we'll review the KVB, the VACMA, and the repeating of signals in cab. Meanwhile, thank you, have a good one, safe drive.